Morning, time now 8 a.m. actually, a minute past 8 a.m. On the Friday, November 8th, 2024 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminars to introduce the latest World Bank report presented by the authors also of the report. In fact, this morning we are marking the 200 sessions that we started in 2019. So on this occasion, we are going to feature the latest edition of the East Europe and Central Asia Economic Update. This one is going to be featuring the education for strong growth in the region. And we do have two distinguished colleagues from the Office of the Chief Economist for the Europe and Central Asia region. We have Ivan Tore, who is a senior economist, and Sergei Kasyanenko, who is the economist, both from the Chief Economist Office for the region. And we are going to listen to their presentation, sharing the main findings and main messages of the report for the next 35 minutes, 40 minutes or so. Then after their presentations, I'll read the questions that we received from you. If you did not have opportunities to send your questions in advance, as usual, please do so by sending your question using the online form posted on the website of the announcement page of this seminar, or you can simply send your question by email to me, or you can post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question on your behalf, asking the speakers to respond to your questions. So with that a brief introduction, I would like to formally welcome and invite the Sergei and Ivan to come in to kick off the presentation. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike Koichi, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this presentation of the Europe and Central Asia Economic Update. I will share my presentation. I will start with the recent developments and outlook for the region, and Ivan will join later to discuss the second chapter of this report, which focuses on education. So let me share my presentation. So in this part, we will talk about the recent developments and the outlook for the region. And basically, you're all aware that over the past several years, the region has been hit by a series of serious economic shocks, which included the COVID pandemic, energy and food price shocks of 2022, and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the key message of this update is that the growth in ECA is stabilizing as the impact of these shocks gradually dissipates, but at rates which are lower than the long-term pre-COVID trend. And over the next couple of years, we expect that the growth of ECA will moderate further. And in most countries, the growth will be lower than the average pre-pandemic trend. So this is the setup of these key messages from the update. So starting with the most recent developments, we now, for the region as a whole, projected the growth this year will settle at around 3.3% or down from 3.5% last year. And this will be below the 4.1% that was registered for 2019 pre-COVID trend. Even so, we upgraded the growth forecast for this year for most regions and most countries. We still expect that the growth will slow in about half of the economies in ECA, including ECA largest economies, Russian Federation and Turkey. And regarding those revisions, as you can see that the biggest increases on this slide in our revisions compared to the previous forecast that were done during the mid-year forecast round, that most of these revisions are concentrated upward revisions in Central Asia, some countries of Eastern Europe, as well as some countries of the South Caucasus. And the reason for this is you can also see that Turkey and Poland and Russia's three largest economies were also revised slightly upward compared to the June forecast. And the reason of this is that This reflects that the recovery in private consumption is stronger than was previously expected. And it was driven by private consumption as well as public spending and investment. However, in a few countries, and those countries in Romania and North Macedonia, there were large revisions, downward revisions to growth, and those revisions reflect somewhat weaker investment, primarily residential construction in Romania and infrastructure spending in North Macedonia. And it's important to remember about these revisions because they also reflect the drivers of growth in our region. So if you look at the largest economies, Russian Federation and Turkey, which account also include Poland, it's about 80-75% of the regional output. Those two largest economies, Russia and Turkey, they were primarily driven the growth in the region, both if you look at the 2019 average, but also most recent recoveries from the COVID shocks as well as from the cost of living crisis. So the resilience of those economies, which was also contributed to the resilience of the region as a whole. But in this year, we expect that the growth in the largest economies is going to slow, and this slowdown will continue next year as well. On contrary to this, countries in the Central Europe are expected to recover. If you can see that last year the growth was very slow, about 1% in Central Europe because of the hit from the energy price and food price shocks, as well as slower demand in the Euro area. But we expect that the growth in that sub-region of ECA is going to slightly improve. And what are the drivers of this growth? And you can see from the left side of this slide that private consumption that started to recover in the third quarter of 2023 is driving the growth recovery in Central Europe and Western Balkans. This is primarily reflects stronger private consumption, but also increased public spending as well as investment that supports growth in the region. However, if you look at the largest economies, such as Turkey and Russia, we already saw some deceleration of growth starting the second quarter of this year. For example, in Turkey, which is the second largest economy, growth slowed sharply in the second quarter to just 2.5% compared to the same quarter of 2023. And this is half as slow as in the first quarter of 2024. In Russia, we already have data, some preliminary estimates for the third quarter of 2023, and the growth also slowed to just 3.2% compared to over 5% in the first quarter of this year. So what is behind this? Because if you look at data for Russia and Turkey, private consumption also remains resilient, albeit it is slowing. And the reason is that in Turkey, we see the results of policy normalization. Policy tightening continues in Turkey, especially monetary policy, as the authorities are trying to curb inflation. Similarly, in Russia, we see that policy tightening persists because inflation remains high, well above the central bank target. But also, Russia exhibits some capacity constraints, such as shortages of labor, and this also constrains growth in Russia. So what are the key drivers of strong domestic demand in the region? And the key drivers across the region is that the household incomes are being supported by tight labor markets, which supports increase in real wages, but also hikes of minimum wages, public sector pay, as well as social benefits are contributing to the growth of incomes in the region. In addition, remittances and flows, which is the important source of income in many countries, especially smaller countries in Western Balkans and Central Asia, remain strong. Also, we recently observed some deceleration in remittances, but they remain strong and they support growth as well, and especially in countries such as Central Asia, South Caucasus. But as I mentioned before, and this is evident in South Caucasus and Central Asia, the post-2022 surge in remittances is starting to abate, and as a result, this may weigh on growth somewhat. Another important driver of private consumption, as well as activity in construction, is continued resilience of the credit to households, and in many countries, mortgage lending. In some countries, it's been supported by the subsidized lending to households for the purchases of residential housing. But also by the strong demand for consumer loans. So this supports growth as well. On the supply side, when we look at the region, the key drivers of growth are construction and services. And regarding this, many countries continue to benefit from the strong inflow of international tourists, especially countries in the Western Balkans, Turkey, and Central Europe. Also, we see that investments in private sector remain robust. This is partly to some one-off factors like reconstruction spending in Turkey and Azerbaijan, but also we see that investment spending in countries such as Central Europe, the Western Balkans remain robust, supported by the inflow of EU funds. Several countries have also seen strong rebound in FDIs, and this is driven by nearshoring as well as increased investments from China. For example, Serbia saw a strong increase in FDI, which is driven by the manufacturing investment from Europe, but also by increasing inflows of FDI from China. Now, what's another important thing that is also contributing to stronger growth in the region is that inflation continues to decelerate. There was some slowdown in disinflation starting this year, and this reflects the fact that some of the governments adjusted administered prices that were previously kept fixed in order to reduce the impact of the energy price shocks. Also, some governments have reinstalled several preferential tax rates, and it contributed to inflation this year. But overall, there is a positive and favorable trend in inflation, that inflation trending down. For example, in September, median headline inflation was at just 4.4% for the region as a whole, significant improvement compared to 2 years ago. And much of this is due to the sharp slowdown in goods price inflation and food price inflation in particular. If you look at the food price inflation, it's only at about 2.8% for a median country in September, compared to over 22% at the end of 2022. And this is a big improvement because for many countries, spending on food is still a big share of the household budget, especially in countries such as Central Asia, South Caucasus, and this helps improve the household purchasing power, contributing to the strength of private consumption. This development is important since for the region as a whole, private consumption drives about 70% of growth. And this means that if the inflation trend continue, if labor markets remains tight, real wages continue to grow, consumption will continue to support growth across the region. However, as you can see on the right side of this panel, that services price inflation remain relatively sticky compared to the goods price inflation. And the key driver of this is the increased labor cost. So the downside of strong wage growth, of course, is that inflation pressures persist, especially core inflation pressures, which is reflected in the persistent services price inflation. If you look at what is driving inflation, and we have data for Central Europe and the Western Balkans, which we can decompose the GDP deflator into the profits, to various drivers of inflation, including profits, labor costs, and taxes. So labor is emerging as the main labor cost, the main driver of inflation pressures in the region. Looking at the nominal labor costs, you can see that the growth of labor costs in ECA far exceeds the growth of labor costs for the European Union as a whole, and is also well above the average growth rate of labor costs 5 years before the pandemic. So this is a big concern for the policymakers, is that high labor costs contribute to the persistence of the inflation pressures in the region. So even so, many central banks started to normalize policy stance by lowering interest rates. In many countries, real policy rates remain well above the pre-pandemic levels. Even in Turkey, the real policy rates stand positive this year. So policies still, there is still a lot of has to be done in order to normalize policy, monetary policy stance in the region. In the region's two largest economies, there is a divergence in terms of monetary policy because both in Turkey and Russia, policy rates, nominal policy rates are at their highest level in almost 2 decades, at 50% in Turkey and 21% in Russia. Russia just raised its policy rates in October to 21%. Primarily because inflation is running well above the target. For example, if you look at Russia, the inflation rate is at over 8%, or twice as high as the central bank target. And this persistence of inflation complicates the return of inflation to policy targets. Another reason why inflation and demand pressures remain high is because fiscal consolidations continue to be delayed across the region. One of these factors that contributes to delay fiscal consolidation is, of course, because of increased social benefits and public sector pay that the government implemented in order to mitigate the cost of living shocks and support demand, but also higher defense spending across the region, as well as high interest spending, contribute to budgetary pressures across the region. So this also complicates policymaking and the return to macroeconomic stability across the region, that at some point there will be a need to implement credible fiscal consolidation plans across the region. Now, when we turn from domestic conditions to external demand, export recoveries across the region remain weak, reflecting subdued growth in the euro area, which is the largest trading partner of ECA. If you look at the euro area, and especially Germany, Germany is the largest export destinations for about 40% of ECA countries, especially in Western Balkans, Central Europe, as well as Turkey. And the European Union as a whole accounts for over 60% of all exports from ECA, excluding Russia, because most exports from Russia are obviously energy. So the weakness in the European Union that we experienced over the last couple of years, and especially conditions in the German manufacturing sector, exerted a drag on export recoveries across ECA. So export did not contribute much to the recent pickup of growth in ECA because of this weakness. And this is especially true for countries that maintain quite high level of integration to the European supply chains, especially European automotive supply chains. Nevertheless, if you look at the right side panel of this chart, of this slide, you can see that some countries actually benefited from the shift in the regional trade patterns and increase of re-exports of goods from, say, Central Asia and South Caucasus to the Russian Federation. This appears to be subsided a little recently, but it's still contributing to growth in several regions. And also some countries, and most importantly Belarus, contributed from the positive growth spillovers from strong growth in the Russian Federation. So what is the external environment going forward? And in terms of the goods exports, external environment remains quite challenging because most of the forecasts for the global growth, as well as for the key trading partners of ECA, are much lower compared to the pre-COVID period. So this means that exports in ECA is likely to struggle to return to the level of their contribution to growth that we observed in the pre-COVID period. So there is a need to find a different source of growth in ECA. On the upside, in many countries, and this is also true, especially true for Western Balkans, for Central Europe, but also true for Central Asia, the exports of services are strong and growing, and not only tourism, but also information and communication services, ICT services. So this could be a strong growth driver of ECA going forward. So having said that, the outlook for the next 2 years for ECA is to continued aggregate slowdown of growth, which will be primarily driven by the expected sharp slowdown of the growth in the Russian Federation as capacity constraints continue to tighten, the positive output gap disappears. So growth in the Russian Federation is expected to slow down by almost 3 times next year. If you look at some other regions, we expect that the growth will also slow a little in Turkey below its long-term average, but in several regions such as Central Asia and South Caucasus, growth is also expected to normalize from its high levels that we observed recently because of this normalization of the shift of trade, investment, and remittances, as well as migration flows between those regions and the Russian Federation. For the rest of the region, we expect the growth to continue to stabilize and improve, and this will be driven again by the strength of the private consumption, and as well as continued decline in inflation, but also by the increased spending on public investment and this will be driven by the high utilization of the funds from the European Union for the Central Europe and the Western Balkans. So we expect that those recovery funds will contribute to growth in Central Europe and Western Balkans. So what are the risks to the outlook? And in our assessment, the downside risks to the outlook are likely to prevail. One of those key risks is an escalation of the global and geopolitical tensions, as well as some increased local policy uncertainty due to the several elections that were recently concluded across the region. So there are those risks that may continue to weigh on investor sentiment and may constrain growth. Another major risk is that we may see increased fragmentation of the global trade and investment networks. And this is especially challenging for the region because of its high openness to trade and investment. So this could be a possible risk. Increased volatility of commodity prices due to possible escalation of conflict in the regions that are major producers of, say, food and energy could also affect negatively the ECA growth outlook, perhaps because of more complication in terms of reducing inflation to targets, but also it may complicate macroeconomic stabilization policies in countries, major commodity producers in ECA countries, such as those that produce energy and other commodities. Another possible risk is that growth, actually recovery in the European Union and Russia may be slower than we expect. And considering that those are key trading partners of many countries in ECA, this will also have could have negative spillovers on the growth for ECA going forward. Also, there is a risk that fiscal adjustment may not be implemented to the extent that they have to be done in order to stabilize public finances and stabilize debt levels. And this may also contribute to higher borrowing costs for the governments, increased spending on interest, as well as may complicate the normalization of monetary policy across many countries. Finally, when we talk about other risks, we need to mention that the effects of the climate change may become much more serious for ECA. And if you look at the most recent developments in terms of the impact of floods and droughts in Europe, they already inflict a lot of economic damage as well as affect the well-being of population in the region, and they could become even worse if climate vulnerabilities are not properly addressed. So what countries can do in order to mitigate these risks? And one of the solutions is to implement policy reforms and investments that boost long-term growth and promote convergence to high income status. And if you look at ECA, you see that the rapid convergence that we observed during the initial transition to markets largely stalled across the region. And this is sad because the region has enormous potential for income convergence. If you look at what happened since the 90s, about half of the countries that converged from middle income countries to high income countries were in ECA. And this means that there is substantial potential and opportunity for other countries in ECA to move to the high income countries. But in order to do this, those countries obviously have to implement reforms that boost per capita growth. And if you see that current ECA middle income countries, the growth is much slower than it was in the first decade during the transition to markets, which means that those countries need to find new drivers of growth. So they cannot rely on simple structural reforms. So market liberalizations that were implemented, they already gave the growth dividends. There is a need to find something that will boost productivity and long-term growth. And Ivan will talk about some of those policy proposals and things that could help ECA achieve faster income conversion. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing and give it to Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. And now, indeed, I will move on to the next chapter of the report. If you give me a few seconds that I will share my screen. Second. So, sharing. So, okay. So as Sergey was saying, the region has an opportunity to converge to high income. And for this to happen, it's important that countries move from, let's say, a model of growth in which they simply adopt innovation that is produced abroad to produce innovation themselves. So a key ingredient in moving, in transitioning to an innovation-led growth model is the human capital, the skills, the talent of the population of the region. And that's why we decided to focus this edition of the ECA Economic Update on how to improve the education systems of the region. So to nurture the talent of the citizens of the region, make it flourish and contribute to the transition to an innovation-led growth model. Because all the evidence we have from historical records and papers that have taking a longer view on economic growth and development is that indeed human capital and skills are key for innovation and development. And if there is something that Europe and Central Asia can be proud of, is on enrollment in education. So people, citizens of ECA, the young generations of ECA, they go to school massively. On average, they complete about 12.6 years of schooling in terms of basic and primary and secondary education. This is almost at the technical limit of the possibilities, means that most of the population, if not all of the population of Europe and Central Asia, achieves high, secondary education. And this is therefore the most educated developing region in the world. And enrollment is not an issue in basic education, and it's not only an issue for tertiary education. The region has the highest levels of tertiary education enrollment in the world, and also the highest tertiary education graduation rates in the world. They exceed the world average significantly. There are countries in the region where about 50 to 60% of those age 30 to 34 today have a university degree. So except for some disadvantaged groups like the Roma population, for instance, in the Western Balkans, which still face challenges in accessing education, we can say that across Europe and Central Asia, there is no problem on enrollment in education. Where there are problems, though, is in the quality of education. So in the last years, the quality of secondary education, for instance, as measured by the PISA test scores, for instance, in math, has been declining. So in this graph, we compare the values for ECA, which are in dark red, the median for ECA, with those of the EU in orange and those of the best performance in East Asia Pacific in blue. And although it may look like the values are relatively stable over time, this is not true, because if you focus then some countries have faced decreases that are equivalent to about 1 to 2 years of schooling. In fact, if we go country by country and we compare the results in the PISA scores for math between 2012 and 2022, all the countries for which this comparison can be done, except for Turkey, faced a decrease over time. So the values in 2022 are considerably lower than those of 2012. And this is looking at the overall system. But where there are particularly gaps in quality is in the vocational education system. The vocational education system in ECA more or less takes care of about 50% of the students in upper secondary. This is very high for world standards. There's no other region in the world where students are enrolled in upper secondary vocational education as in Europe and Central Asia. And most importantly, the big majority of the students that enroll into vocational education in Europe and Central Asia come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So it is the track of choice in secondary education for those that come from disadvantaged and vulnerable backgrounds. What are they getting in this education? Well, unfortunately, they are not getting a great education. In this graph here, what you can see is the percentage of students that are above a basic level of math proficiency in the PISA test of 2022. This is in math. And here the bars indicate the track. The blue bars indicate students in vocational track, and the red bars indicate the students in the general academic track. And what you can see is that the blue bars, the performance, the proficiency in math of those the students enrolled in vocational education is considerably lower than that of those enrolled in the general academic track. And in particular, for instance, look at the case of Romania, where below 10%, not even 10% of the students in vocational education can perform basic math calculations. So vocational education is not providing foundational skills, but also most importantly, is not providing professional skills, which is what students are supposed to acquire when they go to a vocational institution, and particularly in the secondary education. And there are several studies in ECA which show that there is only a very small advantage in the access to the labor market at the beginning of the professional life for those with vocational education when comparing to those with general education. And this advantage disappears very quickly over the course of the professional life. Just a few years after graduation from secondary education, the advantage that vocational track students have in terms of employment and earnings vis-a-vis those with general education disappears. Why is this happening? Well, it happens because the skills these students are learning in vocational education are becoming obsolete. And this has happened more and more often as the labor market changes more rapidly. The skills become quickly obsolete. And vocational education students then face themselves in a situation in which the only skills they have are no longer needed. Therefore, the returns to experience, also the returns to keep working using those skills, are very low. So, as I was saying before, enrollment is good in basic education, quality is declining, and it's particularly a problem in vocational education. But where there is and also a very clear underperformance is in higher education. So this graph that I'm plotting here, this scatter plot, compares on the horizontal axis the quality of basic education as measured, say, for instance, by PISA test scores and equivalent standardized tests. And the vertical axis measures the quality of higher education as calculated from compiling information from different university rankings. This produces a score, which is what is plotted here. And the line you see there is the line that plots the average relationship between these two variables. And what is evident in this graph is that the countries of Europe and Central Asia are below that line. What does it mean? That the countries of Central Asia, for the level of basic education they have a lower quality of higher education that would be expected. That is, the universities of ECA do not match the quality, for instance, of the schools, of the secondary schools or the basic education schools. There is a clear underperformance of the higher education system in ECA. You can see here, for instance, there's a cluster of countries there, which is the countries of the Caucasus and the Western Balkans, where the quality of higher education there is particularly low, even if the quality of basic education is not that bad. But even countries which perform relatively better in basic education, like Poland and Ukraine, are significantly below the fitted line. That is, they have particularly worse universities that one would expect, given the quality of basic education they have. And this is confirmed when we focus on the global rankings of universities. Like in the top 500 of the Times Higher Education ranking of this year, there's only 9 universities which are from ECA, and they're actually from 2 countries. 6 of them are from Russia, and 3 are from Turkey. And why is it a problem to have low-performing universities? Well, is the locus. The higher education system is the locus of innovation. It is only in higher education systems that new innovation is produced. And when these higher education systems have good links with the industry, they are even better at producing innovation. ECA is missing that quality of innovation, that potential productivity of innovation because of very poor universities. Therefore, it's very difficult. It will be very difficult for countries in the region to transition to an innovation-led growth model if they cannot produce innovation themselves in their higher education systems. And the region is in need of this. There is a high demand for higher education graduates in the labor market. And this can be seen, for instance, if we look at the unemployment rates of higher education graduates, which have been decreasing significantly in the last years. So on the one hand, the quality of education they receive is poor. Still, the labor market is demanding them so much that there has been even a relatively high wage premiums in some countries for higher education. And in fact, most enterprise surveys actually place the lack of workers with skills close to the top of the firm constraints. So we have a higher education system that is not producing innovation, that is not delivering in terms of skills, but at the same time, a huge demand. In fact, if we look at the composition of employment in the last 25 years, we've seen a huge increase in the share of jobs that demand higher education. This has increased from around 11% to about 30% from about 11% in the late 1990s and around 30% in the latest data we have available. This is for the whole of ECA. This is information extracted from the labor force service of the region. So how can talent in ECA flourish? How can we, improve the education system? So, the first point is to reverse the decline on basic education quality. And the good news here is that we know how to do it. We know how to improve the teaching of foundational skills, for instance. This is known. The technology is there. We know how to do it. However, we need a concerted political effort to work on that. For instance, a very cost-effective intervention, which for some people seems very, striking, is just providing information on the education systems to all the stakeholders in them: parents, principals, teachers, students, everyone. Just by providing information on academic outcomes, say, by providing information on test scores to principals of schools. This has a potential, a great effect on the, on the academic outcomes of students, because principals then can take decisions on which teacher to assign, which teacher to put on additional training. Just by providing information, this can simply increase the proficiency in basic skills of students. There's also other smart buys in terms of policy interventions, such as supporting teachers with more structured pedagogy that follows scripts and have clear guidelines on how to teach certain subjects. This is not expensive, and this is very effective in terms of improving cognitive skills. And lastly, teaching at the right level. That is, teaching students not according to their age or grade, but according to their learning level. When teachers are faced with having to teach in one single way to students of very different, very heterogeneous learning levels, this is a problem. When teachers can teach at the specific level required by the specific student, this is much more effective. And the new technologies, generative AI, and all these kind of new digital technologies are very helpful in, customizing teaching and to match the learning level of different students. The other set of policies where the countries in ECA have to think seriously about is on what to do with the vocational education system, because as of now, it is not delivering in terms of what it's supposed to deliver. Part of it is because students arrive with very poor foundational skills. Therefore, it's important that countries consider delaying the entry into vocational education. This extra time can also allow students to improve their foundational skills. Rather than enrolling them in vocational education at age 14, do it later, do it at age 16. give these 2 extra years to emphasize, to get the basics right. And this is important even in the once the students are in vocational education. Vocational education is mostly about professional skills, but this cannot happen if students do not have foundational skills. Therefore, there has to keep being a teaching of foundational skills even during vocational education. But in terms of professional skills, what is most important is to make sure that a substantial part of the time is passed, of the teaching of the learning happens in a workplace, because professional skills are better learned in a workplace and not in a classroom. Many countries in the region have classroom-based vocational education as the primary way of teaching vocational education, and this is not conducive to the learning of professional skills. In order to have a higher share of work-based learning, the systems need to bring in private firms to collaborate and work. So there has to be a change of mindset, both of the education system and the private sector, to bring together and really improve the quality of vocational education. In terms of higher education, there are several things that countries can do, and this should be the focus if we are talking about how to move to an innovation-led growth model. So countries in the region, some of them have very, very large university systems that are catering to a shrinking student population, because the population of most ECA countries, except those of Central Asia, is decreasing. So the size of the student cohorts will decrease over time. And these university systems will be just too large, with too much extra capacity. And just by consolidating, by merging universities, merging administrations, this generates enormous efficiency gains that can really improve the quality of the students that still enroll into higher education. Also, as part of this reorganization of the systems, some countries that were particularly part of the former Soviet Union have research centers completely disconnected from the higher education systems, and they have to be brought together, because this is the only way that research can be better and that students can also learn from the best people. And overall, also, there has to be an improvement in management of the universities. There is a lot of evidence that management of human resources in universities is correlated. The quality of management of HR management in universities is correlated with better performance and also better accountability. There has to be the countries need to allow universities to compete on quality also. And lastly, as I was mentioning before, the region is going through a demographic transition in which we are going to have a more aged population. There's population aging happening. So therefore, people will be working for a longer time, and you will have a bigger share of the workforce which is older than before. Therefore, it's important to focus also in investing in lifelong learning and reskilling adult workers. And here, the extra capacity that universities may be facing when, with the shrinking student population in undergraduate degrees, this extra capacity can be actually used to bring in older students, adults that have finished their undergrads like a decade or so ago, to retrain them in the skills that are now demanded in the labor market. But to do this, there has to be a shift from youth-focused approaches to talent development towards practices that are more inclusive of older age groups. So just to conclude, countries in the region really need to improve their education if they really want to keep growing and converging to high income status. And if you want to learn more about this, you can scan the QR code there, and you can look at the whole report. So thank you very much, and I will conclude here and stop sharing now. Give me a second.
Great. Thank you very much, Ivan, and also Sergey earlier presenting the main findings of the latest edition of the Europe and Central Asia Economic Update. Thank you. All right, we received some questions in advance, and also some questions came in during your presentation. I think I'll sort of regroup those questions into two categories. One, broader economic and macro-related question. The other one is more education-focused question. So let me start with the economic outlook-related questions. First one, this came in advance to the seminar. How do you assess the situations and challenges and prospects of Russian Far Eastern region, which is far away from Moscow? What are the roles this area can play in the country, in the ECA region also, in terms of the economy, trade, and other aspects? So this is the first one. Second one, would you please comment on the most important recent challenges Central Asia countries face with, and what are the priority policy actions that Central Asia governments should take immediately, given the global, regional, geopolitical, and economic uncertainties? So I would like to perhaps invite Sergei to make a comment on those two points raised. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Keiichi. These are very good questions, and I'll start with the one on Far East of Russia. We actually don't do specific analysis for the countries, for the regions, but it's a very interesting region in the sense that there are only about 8 million people who live there, but the size of the region is more than the size of Europe. If you look at Moscow, Moscow has about 13 million people. So it's a very sparsely populated region. Obviously, it creates certain challenges in terms of whether you can maintain densely populated urban centers there, and in terms of infrastructure needs, all those things, it's quite challenging. The amount of investment that's needed in order to have large population centers in those cities. But at the same time, the region is very rich in natural resources such as minerals, gold, forests, fisheries, and also in terms of its location, it's like it can be a bridge between the rest of Russia and Asia, such as China, Japan, because it has some ports. So it could be a good, hub to connect Russia to the rest of Asia, as well as to perhaps focus on the exploration of natural resources, and especially those that may be needed for green transition, such as metals and things that are related to the environmentally friendly exploration of natural resources, such as fisheries, forests, etc. So that could be great potential for that region. On the second question about Central Asia, it's also a very good question, because if you look at Central Asia in terms of income per capita, it has one of the lowest per capita for the region as a whole, and also in terms of the growth of GDP per capita, it also has one of the slowest growth of GDP per capita. Obviously, this is due to the faster population growth rates, because if you look at the growth rates of the region, it has high growth rates, but population is also young and growing fast. And the key priority for the governments is to accelerate growth, but also to shift to the growth model that, as Ivan mentioned, that encourages innovation, that encourages private sector participation, that encourages sustainable long-term growth and faster convergence. And one of the key challenges, of course, is the lack of diversification, the predominance of low productivity sectors such as agriculture, also to some extent a bit larger involvement of state-owned enterprises in the economy. And the governments are doing a lot in order to help diversify the economy, but more has to be done in order to encourage more private initiative and more innovation, so that they can achieve sustainable and high growth of incomes and convergence with the rest of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your responses. Let me continue reading questions. Question that came in during your presentation, question from Professor Yoshino from Keio University. Thank you very much for your question. First one, President Trump will increase tariffs. What will be the impact of the big tariff changes of the US to the region? This is the first one. Second part of the question, what will be the impact of the increase of commodity changes to the region, and what will be the best policy to cope with commodity prices? So these are the comment from Professor Yoshino. So probably Sergei, please come in to continue and then responding. Thank you.
Thank you, Keiichi. Excellent questions. I think a lot of people, especially the first one, are thinking very hard about this question. First, what I want to say is that it's a bit too early to say what announcement will actually become actual policy actions by the incoming administration. But if you look at the region, the impact, and I'll just focus on the region, I'll ignore the impact on China and on the rest of the world. The amount of exports from the European Union to the United States is about 500 billion euros annually, or about 3% of the European Union GDP. And most of this is from the Euro area countries such as Germany, Italy, France, Netherlands. So this potentially can have large impact on the exports from the European Union if there will be a uniform tariff imposed on all foreign goods that come into the US. Again, we don't know what's going to happen, what policy action is going to be taken. There are some estimates that are already available from different research organizations. They actually they vary a lot, but they're quite modest in terms of the impact on GDP in the European Union. So they say that could be from 0.5 percentage point of GDP to 1.5 percentage point of GDP. So they're very wide, depend on the assumptions about impact elasticities, about the possible introduction of tariffs. Another important variable that is also a big unknown is the scale of retaliatory actions that the other countries may impose in response to increased tariffs, and also the extent of exemptions. We don't know how wide these measures are going to be, what countries they're going to affect, what products they're going to affect. But overall, if trade policy is going to become more more protectionist, and if trade tensions are going to increase, this will obviously contribute to global policy uncertainty. This will contribute to the pressure on investor sentiment, and it will have a negative impact on the growth in the European Union, and as a result, negative growth spillovers for the region as a whole. And that's why we cite this as one of the key risks, one of the top risks, that increased geopolitical tensions and policy uncertainty could weigh on growth in the region. So it's a negative risk. The extent of the threat is still big unknown, but it's a potential downside risk for the region. And the second question is about volatility of commodity prices. It's also very relevant for the region because, as we experienced 2 years ago, large fluctuations and changes in commodity prices have a potential negative impact on the region because many consumers in the region spend a large share of their income on food and energy. So if there are large changes to those commodity prices, they will directly affect household purchasing power, lead to lower private consumption and depress growth. There are not that direct answer what can be done because many things can be done to improve resilience to commodity price fluctuations. And one of those things, and the World Bank works on many of these things in the region, and many have different projects in order to strengthen resilience to commodity price fluctuations. So one policy, broader policy, and many countries in Europe are already implementing this policy, is to improve energy efficiency. This will greatly reduce the vulnerability to energy price fluctuation. So accelerate green transition, improve reliance on renewable sources of energy, and reduce your reliance on fossil fuels. Second one is to improve food security. Also, the World Bank does a lot on this in the region. And this means you have to increase productivity in agriculture, you have to improve yields, and you have to invest into climate mitigation adaptation to make agriculture more resilient to climate change. And this will greatly enhance the ability of the countries to withstand shocks to food prices. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your responses. So let me continue reading the question related to education. So this will be for Ivan. Some questions actually that you already sort of mentioned and then addressed during your presentation, but let me read anyway the series of questions. Does technologies help accelerate and shift the situations in education in the region? How do you assess the impact of the pandemic on education in the region? How can quality of universities and higher educational institutions in the region be improved? And also, Professor Yoshino continue raising the question related to education. Actually, this is rather a comment. If online or video education is extensively provided so that everyone can listen using their mobile phones for free 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it will push up the quality of workers and students. So probably a technology related the point. So Ivan, any responses, comments on those points? Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi, for reading the questions, and thank you for the professor also for his question, for his comment. Actually, let me start by addressing this issue of technology broadly. So, what's the impact of technology in education? This is a very broad question. So, on the one hand, technological changes affect the demand for skills. Uh, when a new technology is implemented in a firm, the type of tasks that workers do change, and therefore, the type of skills that you need to have to do those tasks at the work change. Therefore, necessarily when there's a technological change, this influences education by changing the demand for skills, right? Some things will be more demanded than others. And what we are seeing lately in the last decades or so in most countries, the current way technology is changing is increasing the demand of the use of people that are proficient in doing what is called non-routine cognitive tasks. That is, tasks that do not involve routines, because those are probably automated, and that they involve less manual work, that is, it's more cognitive work. And also, there's an increased demand of social tasks. Most of the occupations right now demand that people do carry out interpersonal tasks, talk to other people, while before a lot of work was just about doing something in your desk or in your workplace. This therefore means that, the type of skills we learn at school, have to adapt to this change. But the important thing is what does not change when there is technological change. And what does not change is the demand for foundational skills, which is, basic reading, literacy, and numeracy, basic math. That remains, because why? Technology changes, there are demands for new skills. And, we as human beings will have to probably learn new things over time. And the only way we can learn new things over time is if we are very good at least, having basic cognitive skills, like, how to read, knowing how to perform basic calculations. These foundational skills are fundamental for learning how to learn new skills in the future, new tasks. So that is not changing with technological change. Foundational skills are always going to be needed, and more in the new in the coming time. And more specifically, technology also affects how education takes place in the classroom. And this is the comment that the professor was referring to, the use of, digital tools in the class. Yes, they are very useful. And as I was mentioning in my presentation, these kind of tools can also help to customize and personalize the teaching to the actual learning level of students. And this is very, very effective in, making students learn better. And, this other question was on the impact of the pandemic on education in the region. This was a test also for this kind of new digital tools, right? So there is evidence that during the pandemic, in those countries where these digital tools were used more intensively to, to have classes over Zoom in a very dynamic and good way, that helped. But in other countries, and actually most of the region, we saw a decrease in the quality in test scores during the pandemic. Therefore, the decrease, the impact of the pandemic definitely was negative. And most importantly, it was particularly negative in the best performing countries, because in the best performing countries, 1 hour of teaching, 1 week of teaching provides more knowledge, more learning to students that in worse performing countries. Paradoxically, shutting schools in best performing countries has a bigger impact on the learning of students than shutting schools in low performing countries, because in these countries, unfortunately, kids are not learning a lot in school. So, if you just shut the school for a long time, they're not losing a lot because they are not learning a lot. In other countries where the systems are very good, shutting schools down, that was, particularly damaging. And lastly, the question on the quality of university, how to improve the quality of university and higher education institutions. I think I addressed this a bit in the presentation already, so I'm not going to extend myself there. And I invite everyone to read the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With us this morning, connecting from Washington, we have Sergei Kasyanenko and Ivan Ture, who actually are with the Office of the Chief Economist for Central Asia and Europe and Central Asia. Sorry, I keep mistakenly pronouncing your unit names, but Europe and Central Asia presenting the latest edition of the Europe and Central Asia Economic Update, the fall 2024 edition, Better Education for Stronger Growth. Thank you very much, both of you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. All right,
Bye-bye.
so we continue organizing many seminars. In fact, today at the 12 p.m. Japan Standard Time, we are going to organize the hybrid seminar featuring the latest report titled Recipe for Livable Planet, Achieving Net Zero Emissions in the Agri-Food Systems. This will be held at 12 p.m. in Japan Standard Time today. You would need to register to obtain the WebEx link to observe and participate in the seminar. And also next week, we are going to organize a online seminar on Commodity Market Outlook latest edition. This is going to be Thursday next week. And then another seminar featuring the Africa Pulse, which is the Africa version of the Regional Economic Update. This is going to be on Friday next week. So thank you very much. Have a nice weekend and see you later actually at 12 p.m. today. Thank you.